So a lot of the philosophical work that's been done on decision theory has focused on the question of how you should deliberate about what to do when the decision that you're facing is one that requires you to think of your own deliberation as embedded in the world's causal order. And in particular, it forces you to think that for that reason, the outcome of your deliberation, what you decide to do, is in principle predictable by other people. Today, I want to focus on another philosophical aspect of decision theory that's been discussed by some people, but hasn't received as much attention. And that's the question of how you should deliberate about what to do when the decision that you're facing requires you to think of the future as being just as metaphysically settled as the past. So in particular, I'm going to focus on two decisions. Here's the first one. So it's Christmas Eve, and you're sitting underneath the Christmas tree, sort of looking at the packages, and there's two packages, one that's for you and the other is for your sister. And you know that one of the packages contains this year's best toy and the other one contains a lump of coal, but you don't know whether Santa gave the toy to you or your sister. And as you're sitting there, you're kind of absentmindedly placing stickers on the packages. But these stickers, they're just decorative. They don't make any difference with respect to who gets to open which package. And as you're sitting there doing this, the oracle arrives with news from the future. And she tells you, in fact, the package that you're going to put the reindeer sticker on, that one contains the toy. So ask yourself, if the only thing that you care about is who gets the toy and who gets the lump of coal, is this a decision where you have instrumental reason to put the reindeer sticker on your package rather than your sister's? Here's the other decision I'm going to think about. We're going to flip a fair coin, so it has a 50% chance of landing on heads and a 50% chance of landing on tails. And before we flip it, I offer you a bet that pays out $150 if the coin lands heads, and it only costs $50. So this is a favorable bet. If circumstances were ordinary, then this is the kind of bet you would be happy to buy. But circumstances aren't ordinary because before you make up your mind about whether to buy the bet or not, the oracle arrives with news from the future and she tells you, in fact, that coin is going to land tails. So ask yourself, in this decision, do you have instrumental reason to buy the bet? Do you have instrumental reason to bet that the coin lands heads? So a lot of people have looked at decisions like these and thought they pose a kind of novel and distinctive threat to causal decision theory. So in particular, David Lewis said that these kinds of decisions are much more problematic for decision theory than the Newcomb problems. Hugh Price thinks that if we're causalists, then these kinds of decisions push us towards being subjectivists about causation. Christopher Hitchcock and Reuben Stern say that we have to modify causal decision theory in order to get the right judgment about these kinds of cases. And Jack Spencer denies the possibility of a certain kind of problematic foreknowledge, specifically in order to avoid decisions that he views as counterexamples to causal decision theory. My thesis here today is going to be that these decisions involving foreknowledge don't pose any novel problems for causal decision theory. All of the supposed problem cases are either not problems because causal decision theory says the correct thing about these decisions, or they are problems, but they're not problems for causal decision theory as such. Instead, they're problems for our theories of subjunctive supposition. Or they are problems for causal decision theory, but they're not new problems for causal decision theory. They are the kinds of problems that we encounter in sort of familiar, comfortable cases involving prediction. This final class of problem cases I'm not going to talk about here today, but if you're interested, they're discussed in the paper, and we can talk about them in Q&A. Nonetheless, I think that these kinds of decisions involving foreknowledge can teach and illustrate important lessons for those of us who are causalists. In particular, I think that they give a vivid illustration of the fact that your intuitive judgments about instrumental value can be led astray when you suffer from a kind of illusion of control, when you suffer from the illusion that you have control over matters that you don't actually have any control over. They also teach us, I think, that we shouldn't confuse the probability that an outcome would result were you to choose a certain option with the chance that that outcome has conditional on your choosing that option. I think there are other lessons that decisions made with foreknowledge teach us, but I'm not going to talk about them in the talk. I discuss them in the paper. Let me start off by saying a little bit more about causal decision theory. I'm going to assume that when you're making a decision, there's some collection of available acts that you have to choose between. There's some collection of ways that the world might be. I'll call those things worlds. And I'm going to take for granted that you have a credence distribution over those worlds, and that for every world, there's some degree to which you desire that world to be actual. I'll write that D of W, and I'll call that the desirability of that world. And if we're causal decision theorists, there's one additional thing that we're going to have to stipulate in order to have a well-defined decision problem. And to introduce that sort of final element, I'm going to start with what I see as the kind of core normative claim of causal decision theory. As I understand it, the core normative commitment of causal decision theory is that you should make up your mind about which act to choose by considering how desirable things would be were you to choose each of the alternative acts. So there's an important component of the decision, which is your views about what would likely happen were you to choose each of the available acts. And I'm going to encode that kind of information in this function here, which I'm going to call would sub A. And the way that would sub A works is you hand it some possible world, and what it hands you back is a probability distribution over worlds. The interpretation is that the probability that would sub A at W gives to W star is just how likely you think it is that W star would result were you to choose A at W. And since if you were to choose A at W, you would certainly choose A, it makes sense to require that the probability that would sub A at W gives to W, or sorry, gives to A is 100%. In other words, you're certainly going to choose A were you to choose A. You certainly would choose A were you to choose A. And any function, by the way, that has this general shape to it and satisfies that constraint is known as an imaging function. So this function would sub A is an imaging function. Now I'm going to introduce a little bit of linear algebra on this slide. And I understand that not everyone's familiar with linear algebra. And so if you find what I'm saying on this slide confusing, don't worry about it. The whole reason that I'm introducing this kind of linear algebra representation of things is just that it allows me to present things in a simpler way later on, in a way that I think makes the philosophical points easier to appreciate. So don't worry too much if you get lost by the things that I'm about to say. So I'm going to represent your credences with a 1 by n vector, where the ith column is your credence in the world W sub I. And I'm going to represent your desires with an n by 1 column vector, where the ith row is the desirability of the world W sub I. And I'm going to introduce a matrix for the imaging function. So this matrix tells you, the way to think about it is that each row gives you the probability distribution over worlds that you get were you to perform A at that world. So this matrix I have here says that were you to perform A at world W1, you think it's 1/4 likely that W2 would result. You think it's 1/8 likely that Wn would result. Were you to choose A at W2, you think certainly W1 would result. And were you to choose A at Wn, you think there's a 1/5 probability that W1 would result, a 2/5 probability that W2 would result, and a 1/100th probability that Wn would result. Or just in general, the idea is that this matrix tells you the probability, your probability that the column world would result were you to choose A at the row world. And then what causal decision theory says is that you should choose an option that maximizes utility. And the way that utility, or U, is normally defined as like this. And I find that difficult to think about. I think it's a bit easier if we use the kind of linear algebra representation that I introduced in the previous slide. And if we do, we get this expression here. And so I think the important thing that you have to understand about utility is that there are three things that you need to know in order to calculate the utility of an act. You need to know what your credences are, you need to know what your desires are, and you need to know what your views are about what would happen were you to perform that action. You take those three components, you multiply them together, and that gives you the utility of the action. So causal decision theory says you should try to maximize utility. Contrast that with evidential decision theory, which says you should try to maximize what I'm going to call news value, or V. And the way that V works is you start with not your unconditional credences, but your credences conditional on your performing the action A. And then given those conditional credences, you take an expectation of desirability. So what V is telling you is how good or how desirable would you expect the world to be were you to learn just that you performed the action A. So it's in that sense in which V measures the news value of an act, how happy you should be to learn that you performed the act, or how sad you should be to learn that you performed the act. I think in part because it makes for a nice parallel between causal and evidential decision theory, one way that causal decision theory is often presented is by grouping together the imaging function with your credences. So if you multiply your credences by the imaging function, you get just a new probability function, which we can call your credences imaged on A. And this makes for a nice kind of parallel where you can say, look, according to evidential decision theory, you should use a probability function that's been updated on the indicative supposition that you do choose A. Whereas for causal decision theory, you should use a probability function that's been updated on a subjunctive supposition that you were to choose A. And I think it's a nice parallel. I think, unfortunately, that way of understanding causal decision theory has both led to some misunderstandings about what causal decision theory is committed to. And secondly, I think that it obscures the core claim about instrumental value that lies at the heart of causal decision theory. So the first point is that some people have looked at this definition of utility and thought, oh, so the causalist thinks that when you perform an action, it's not in principle predictable by other people or other parts of the world. And so when you learn that you've performed an action, you should genuinely update your credences by imaging them on the performance of that action. I think that's just a misunderstanding of what causal decision theory is up to. You shouldn't change your credences by imaging them on the performance of the action. It's just that you should use this imaged probability function in the calculation of utility. But even putting that misunderstanding aside, I think that it obscures the core normative claim sitting at the heart of causal decision theory, the core claim about instrumental value. And I think that it's easier to appreciate that claim if we group the imaging function not with your credences, but instead with your desires. So if we multiply the imaging function by your desires, call that your desires imaged on A, we get something that tells us how desirable the world would be were you to choose A. And then utility is just an expectation of that. It's an expectation of how desirable your choosing A would make the world. And I think that the right way to understand causal decision theory is that it says that that quantity, D sub A, so how desirable the world would be were you to choose A, that represents the instrumental value of a choice. The instrumental value of a choice is what it would bring about. And one nice way of appreciating that normative commitment is with cases like this. So I'll call this case no difference. And imagine you've got two boxes in front of you. You can either take the one on the left that we can call lefty, or you can take the one on the right that we'll call righty. And there's no difference between these boxes. You know that there's no difference between them. You know that they contain exactly the same thing. But if it was predicted that you would take lefty, then we put $100 in both boxes. Whereas if it was predicted that you would take righty, then we left both of those boxes empty. And you take these predictions to be very reliable. For the sake of simplicity, let's say that you take them to be perfectly reliable. So you're certain that the predictions are going to be accurate. So in this decision, think about what happens if you find yourself inclining towards taking lefty. Well, if you find yourself inclining towards taking lefty, you should think it's pretty likely that I was predicted to take lefty. So it's pretty likely that there's $100 sitting in front of me. On the other hand, if you find yourself inclining towards taking righty, that's pretty good evidence that it was predicted that you would take righty. So it's pretty good evidence that there's no money sitting in front of you. So this is a case where, importantly, it's under your control whether you take lefty or take righty. So it's under your control, sort of what kind of evidence you give yourself about what was predicted. If you incline towards taking lefty, well, that's something you can do. And when you do that, you will manufacture for yourself the evidence that you will take lefty. And you'll manufacture for yourself the evidence that you're predicted to take lefty. So you'll manufacture for yourself the evidence that there's $100 there. On the other hand, you can just as easily incline towards taking righty, and that's a way of manufacturing for yourself the evidence that there's no money sitting in front of you. So this is a decision where your rational credence that there's money in front of you is under your control. By just choosing which box to take, you can raise or lower your credence that there's money sitting in front of you. Nonetheless, by stipulation, the amount of money in the boxes is not under your control. So this is a case where it's under your control how confident you should be that there's money in front of you. But the amount of money in front of you is not under your control. And I think that in cases like that, we're susceptible to a kind of agential illusion. It's an illusion of control. We're susceptible to the illusion of thinking that we have control over whether or not we're going to get $100 or not. But in fact, that's an illusion. You only have control over what you should believe about how much money is in the boxes. And I think in this case, I mean, there's just definitely a strong intuition that it's rational to take lefty. I think that sometimes you hear people talk about decision theory and they say things like, I have evidentialist intuitions or I have causalist intuitions. And it makes it seem like what's going on here is just a fight over intuitions, and all the sort of battles in decision theory are going to be settled by looking at cases and seeing which theory gets the most intuitive verdicts. And I think that, just as an aside, I think this is the wrong way to think about decision theory. I think that it's pretty obvious that there's a strong intuition here that you should take lefty. There are some other strong intuitions that we have, and those other intuitions come into conflict with the strong intuition that you should take lefty. And the question isn't sort of which decision theory is more intuitive. The question is, which of these intuitions are we going to accept and which are we going to reject? And what are we going to say about the ones that we reject? But I think all causalists should agree there is a strong intuition that you should take lefty. But the causalists should say that intuition is not to be trusted because it's just a result of this illusion of control. It's a result of us conflating control over what we should believe about the world with control over the way that the world actually is. And I think to correct for that agential illusion of having control over how much money is in the boxes in front of you, causalists should say that you can step back and consider how much instrumental value each of these choices have from a better informed third personal perspective. So to do that, suppose it's not you making this decision about whether to take lefty or righty, but suppose it's your friend. And suppose that while your friend doesn't know what's inside the boxes, you do. Well, then you're either going to look in and you're going to see that there's $100 in both boxes, or you're going to look in and see that there's no money in either box. And I think if you look in and you see that there's $100 in both boxes, it's really difficult to see a decision to take lefty over righty as having any practical value at all, as having any kind of instrumental value at all. From this kind of better informed third personal point of view, it looks like taking lefty over righty doesn't accomplish anything. Nothing changes if you look in and you don't see anything in the boxes. Taking lefty over righty wouldn't get you any more money. So I think from this better informed perspective, the feeling that we have that you're rationally required to take lefty just vanishes. So this is what I meant when I said earlier, we have these conflicting intuitions about the case. We have, from the first personal point of view, it looks like you should take lefty. From a third personal point of view, it looks like you shouldn't. And the question is, well, which of these intuitions is reliable? And what are we going to say about the one that we think is unreliable? And I think causalists say that this, the intuition we have from the better informed third personal point of view is the reliable one. And what we should say about the other intuition is that it's the result of an illusion that we have control over how much money is in the boxes, even though we don't. In fact, from this kind of better informed third personal point of view, a preference for taking lefty can seem positively irrational. And to appreciate that, consider a variant of the decision where, in order to take lefty, your friend has to pay $90. Well, then, if they find themselves inclining towards taking lefty, they'll think very likely they're going to walk away with $10 because they're going to get the $100 in the box minus the 90 that they paid to take it. Whereas if they find themselves inclining towards taking righty, they think they're going to walk away with nothing. So evidential decision theory will say you should pay the $90 to take the left box. But here, I think from this third personal, better informed point of view, it looks like there's negative instrumental value in taking lefty, because you can look inside the boxes and you can see they both have $100. And so it looks like paying $90 is just, you're throwing that money away. You could have had 100 if only you'd taken righty. And similarly, if you look in and see that both boxes are empty, it just seems from the third personal point of view that taking lefty is throwing away $90, and you're not accomplishing anything by throwing that money away. So I think there's a general lesson that causalists should draw from cases like this. The general lesson is when you have control over your rational credence that some proposition is true, but you know for sure that you don't have control over whether that proposition is true, your intuitive judgments about which actions are instrumentally valuable can be led astray. And they can be led astray because you're conflating control over what you should think about the world with control over the way that the world actually is. And in these kinds of cases, one way of controlling for that illusion of control is by considering what instrumental value a choice would have from a better informed third personal point of view. Or as David Lewis puts the same point, it's irrational to counsel a policy of managing the news so as to get good news about matters which you have no control over. So let me go back to the very first decision that I raised at the start of the talk. It's just to refresh your memory. You're sitting under the Christmas tree on Christmas Eve, placing stickers on these two packages. You know that either you or your sister got the year's hottest toy and that the other one got a lump of coal. And the oracle tells you that the package that you put the sticker on is going to be the one that contains the toy. I'm going to take for granted, by the way, that this is what you take the causal structure of this case to be. So here you can think about Santa, outcome, you, and oracle as variables. So Santa is a variable that tells you whether Santa gives the toy to you or your sister. You is a variable which says whether you put the sticker on your gift or your sister's gift. Outcome is a variable that tells you sort of both who gets the toy and where you put the sticker. And oracle is a variable which says whether the oracle tells you that the stickered package contains the toy or the stickered package contains the lump of coal. And what Santa, who Santa decides to give the toy to and where you decide to put the sticker determines what the outcome is. And what the outcome is determines what the oracle says. And it could also be that the oracle's prophecy has a causal influence on what you decide to do. But it needn't be that you make up your mind in a way that's sensitive to the oracle's prediction. So I have this gray arrow here to indicate that there may be causal influence going from oracle to you, but there needn't be. So in this case, Um, so long as you get the toy, you're happy. And so long as your sister gets the toy, you're sad. You don't care intrinsically about whether the sticker is on your package or your sister's package. And for that reason, causal decision theorists is going to look at this case and say, you have no instrumental reason to put the sticker on your package rather than your sister's package. Think about it. Well, if you put the sticker your on your own package and you were gifted the toy, then you would have still gotten the toy even if you put it on your sister's package. And if you put it on your sister's package and your sister is gifted the toy, well, your sister still would have been gifted the toy even if you put it on your own package. So there's no instrumental value in where you put the sticker according to causal decision theory. Now, Christopher Hitchcock thinks that's the wrong result. And he proposes a modification of causal decision theory, which will tell you that in this case, you should put the sticker on your sister's package. So I'm going to briefly introduce what that revision to causal decision theory is. It's not super important, so I'll try to go through this a bit quickly. But to introduce it, let me sort of start off by representing the definition of utility that I gave earlier. So let me call E your ordinary evidence, and F is your foreknowledge. So it's your knowledge about, or your evidence about information. Sorry, it's your evidence about times after the choice. And let C naught be your prior credences. Well, then orthodox causal decision theory thinks that your credences are just your prior credences updated on your evidence, so conditioned on your evidence. Hitchcock thinks that that's wrong because he thinks you should take into account your foreknowledge in a way different than the way that you take into account your ordinary knowledge. So in particular, he thinks you should start with your prior credences, then condition them on your ordinary evidence, then image that conditional probability function on the performance of the action, and then finally take that resulting probability function and condition it on your foreknowledge. And to get into Hitchcock's headspace here, I think the way he's thinking about it is, your ordinary evidence is about times before the action. So you should first take into account that evidence, then take into account your performance of the action by imaging on A, and then take into account the evidence which comes after the performance of the action. So you're kind of taking your evidence into account sequentially through time is the idea. And the only thing that really is important for this complicated definition here is to notice that the very last thing you do is condition on your foreknowledge. So the probability function that you're using to take an expectation of desirability is going to be certain of your foreknowledge. And so when we look at this case involving sticker, if you condition on your foreknowledge, you'll be certain that you were gifted the toy if and only if, I should say not you'll be certain. The probability function you're using to calculate utility will be certain that you were gifted the toy if and only if you put the sticker on your own package. So for that reason, the H value, H for Hitchcock, the H value of putting the sticker on yours is going to be higher than the H value of putting the sticker on your sister's package. And Hitchcock will say that you are rationally required to place the sticker on your own package. So I think if we are evidential decision theorists, we should be happy with that verdict. But I think if we're causalists, and if we've learned lesson number 1, then we should be much more suspicious of what Hitchcock has done here. Because after all, this is a case where you have control over your rational credence that you get the gift, but you have no control over whether or not you get the gift. Because if you find yourself putting the sticker on your own package, you're very, very confident that you're going to get the gift. And if you find yourself putting the sticker on your sister's package, you're going to end up not very confident at all that you'll get the gift. So this is the kind of case that lesson 1 warns us to be on our guard about. And it tells us that in order to think more carefully about which decision is rational in this case, to correct for any potential illusions of control, we should consider what instrumental value these choices have from a kind of better informed third personal perspective. So to do that, suppose that it's not you making this decision, but it's your sister. And just so that we don't have to worry about changing the utilities, let's suppose that your sister wants you to get the toy. She's just a better person than you are. Santa really should have given her the toy. So, oh, and let's suppose that you know what's inside the packages. Your sister doesn't know, but you do. So then you're either going to know that you've received the toy or that your sister has received the toy. And if the thing that you know is that you've received the toy, I think it's just really difficult to see your sister's decision to put a sticker on your package as having any instrumental value at all. It just doesn't make a difference with respect to who gets the package. Likewise, if you look in and you see that your sister is getting the toy, it's really difficult to see any sort of instrumental disvalue in your sister putting the sticker on her own package. She still would have gotten the toy, even if you'd put the sticker on the other one. So I think from this better informed third personal perspective, the sense that there's any kind of instrumental value in putting the sticker on your package just vanishes. In fact, from this perspective, a preference for putting the sticker on your own package can look instrumentally disvaluable. It can look irrational. So to appreciate that, consider a version of the decision where in order to place the sticker on your package, your sister has to pay. And she has to pay an amount of money that she would be willing to pay in order for you to have the gift. So now the best possible outcome is that your sister puts the sticker on hers and you get the toy, because then she doesn't have to pay, you get the toy. That's the best possible outcome. Next best is one where she pays and you get the toy. It's even worse if she doesn't pay and you don't get the toy. And the worst of all possible outcomes is one where she pays and even after paying, you don't get the toy. I think in this kind of case too, Hitchcock is going to look at it and say, well, it's a better state of affairs where she pays and you get the toy than it is where you don't pay, or sorry, she doesn't pay, and you don't get the toy. So he'll say that you have instrumental reason to put the sticker, or sorry, not you, your sister has instrumental reason to put the sticker on your package. But from your perspective, you're either going to look into those packages and see that you've been gifted the toy, in which case it looks like, well, your sister's just making things worse by putting the sticker on your package. You would still have gotten the toy if she put it on the other package, and she wouldn't have had to pay. Likewise, you might look in and see that there's nothing, oh, sorry, you might look in and see that your sister got the toy, in which case, well, paying to put the sticker on your package would just make things worse. So either way, there's instrumental disvalue in putting the sticker on your package. And so I think causal decision theory says, I think correctly, that you have no reason to place the sticker on one gift over the other because it doesn't make a difference. And I think that causalists should be perfectly happy with that verdict. They should say, yes, it's true that there's a strong intuition in this case that you're rationally required to put the sticker on your own package. But causalists should understand that the same way they understand the intuition in cases like no difference. It's a result of you having an illusion of control. It seems to you that by putting the sticker on your package, you can make it be the case that Santa gave you the toy, and that by putting it on your sister's package, you can make it the case that Santa gave your sister the toy. But by stipulation, that's not true. By stipulation, the only thing you have control over is what to believe about who Santa gave the toy to. So let me say that foreknowledge is inadmissible if when you have that foreknowledge, you know for sure that the chance of some proposition is X, even though your credence in that proposition should not be X. So there's a number of authors, Ned Hall, Chris Meacham, Jack Spencer, who think that it's impossible to have that kind of foreknowledge. And one of Spencer's reasons is that if that kind of foreknowledge were possible, then causal decision theory would face counterexamples. So, I mean, all three of these authors, by the way, give independent arguments that that kind of foreknowledge is impossible. I'm not persuaded by those arguments, but I'm not going to respond to them directly here. So to appreciate why Spencer thinks that inadmissible foreknowledge would make trouble for CDT, let's go back to the second decision that I brought up in the introduction. So just to refresh everybody's memory, we're going to flip a fair coin, and you're offered a bet with favorable odds. So it pays out $150 if the coin lands heads. It only costs $50. But before you decide whether to take that bet, the oracle arrives. She tells you, in fact, the coin is going to land on tails. It's very natural to look at a case like that and say, well, in this decision, you know for sure that the chance of the coin landing on heads is 50%, but you should be pretty confident that the coin is going to land on tails. Spencer doesn't want to describe that case, doesn't want to describe the case in that way. He wants to say, sort of precisely because it's rational for you to be less than 50% confident in heads, you should expect that the chance of heads is somewhere much less than 50%. And the reason is that he doesn't want it to be the case that in decisions like this, your credence can depart from the known chances. To appreciate why he thinks that, this is the decision matrix for this decision. If the coin lands heads and you buy the bet, you get 100. If it lands tails and you buy the bet, you lose 50. And if you don't buy the bet, obviously you don't win or lose any money. So Spencer thinks if you know that the coin is going to land tails because the oracle has told you, then it's irrational to buy the bet. Because if you know that the coin is going to land tails, then buying the bet is just signing up to lose $50. So I think that Spencer's right about that. I agree with him about that. But he thinks if we were to say that your credence has departed from the known chance in this case, if we were to say that the chance of heads remains at 50% even after you have this foreknowledge, then causal decision theory would tell you that you should buy the bet. And I disagree with Spencer about that. I think we disagree about what causal decision theory says in this kind of decision. But first, let me explain why Spencer thinks CDT is going to tell you to buy the bet. So in this decision, there are four possibilities. It could be that the coin lands heads and you buy the bet. It could be that the coin lands heads and you don't buy the bet. It could be that the coin lands tails and you buy the bet, or it could be that the coin lands tails and you do not buy the bet. Because you have foreknowledge that the coin is definitely going to land on tails, your credence in those first two possibilities is going to be 0. And your credence that the coin lands tails and you bet will just be your credence that you bet. And your credence that the coin lands tails and you do not bet will just be your credence that you do not bet. We can just suppose that your desires are linear in dollars. So, if you buy the bet and the coin lands heads, you get 100. If you buy the bet and the coin lands tails, you lose 50. And if you don't buy the bet, you just get 0. And then, sort of crucially, this is the assumption that I'm going to object to later on, Spencer assumes that the imaging function is like this. So whether you buy the bet or not, there's a 50% probability of the coin landing heads and a 50% probability of the coin landing tails. If we make that assumption, which amounts to assuming that the imaging function at a world just is the objective chance function at that world conditioned on the performance of your action. If we make that assumption, Spencer makes the same assumption about the imaging function if you don't buy the bet, although that imaging function just isn't relevant for the decision since it's a guaranteed $0 if you don't buy the bet. If we make those assumptions, then it turns out that the utility of buying the bet is $25 and the utility of not buying the bet is 0. So causal decision theory says, go ahead, you should buy the bet. So I agree that would be a bad outcome, but I think that we should reject one of the crucial assumptions that Spencer made in sort of deriving that commitment of CDTs. And that's the commitment that the probability of what would happen were you to choose A at W is just the objective chance at W of that thing happening conditional on your choosing A. So this, this isn't an assumption that Spencer gets from nowhere. It follows from David Lewis's decision theory, together with David Lewis's principle of chance deference, the principle, because sort of Lewis doesn't formulate his decision theory with an imaging function in the way that I've done it here. but he shows that it's equivalent to a formulation involving an imaging function, given a certain definition of the imaging function. And that definition, together with Lewis's principle, implies this constraint here. Rabinowitz looked at this stuff back in this, I guess back in the 80s, and said, well, that assumption of Lewis's conflicts with this principle that Rabinowitz thought was very plausible called strong centering. And what strong centering says is just that, if you're at some world and you actually choose A at that world, sorry, let me not use the word actually. If you choose A at that world, then if you were to choose A at that world, you would remain at that world. In other words, if you were to choose A at W, W is the world that would result. Or if A is true at some world, then the probability distribution you would get if you were to choose A at that world gives all of its probability to W. So Rabinowitz calls that assumption strong centering, and the analog of strong centering for counterfactuals is validated by both David Lewis and Stalnaker's semantics. So that in the context of the semantics for counterfactuals, the analog of the assumption is that if A and C are both true, then if A were true, C would be true. But even though Lewis accepts strong centering in his semantics for counterfactuals, he rejects it in decision theory for reasons that aren't entirely clear to me and are not explained clearly to the reader. But nonetheless, Rabinowitz thinks that there's good reason to accept strong centering. And I agree with Rabinowitz. So I think we should accept this principle, strong centering. And that's enough to reject one of the key assumptions in Spencer's derivation of causal decision theory's commitments. But I think, unfortunately, just accepting strong centering isn't going to help us out with cases like inadmissible foreknowledge. And the reason is that if we just impose strong centering, then what causal decision theory says about this case will depend upon how confident you are that you'll buy the bet. And in particular, causal decision theory will say, if you're pretty confident that you're not going to buy the bet, then you should buy it. So to appreciate that, notice that if we take the imaging function we had earlier, and we just impose the constraint that it satisfies strong centering, then the only thing that's going to change is the first and the third rows. So the first row will say, look, if you're at a world where the coin lands heads and you take the bet, then if you were to take the bet, you would still be at the world where the coin lands heads and you take the bet. And if you're at a world where the coin lands tails and you take the bet, then if you were to take the bet, you would still be at the world where the coin lands tails and you take the bet. However, if you're at one of the possibilities where you don't take the bet, then if you were to take the bet, there's a 50% chance that the coin would land heads, and there's a 50% chance that the coin would land tails. And so when we think about how you're going to think about the utility of your choices, given that assumption about the imaging function, well, if you're very confident that you're going to buy the bet, then you should be very confident you're going to lose $50. And if you were to not buy the bet, well, there's a 50% chance that you get nothing and a 50% chance that you get nothing. So you would definitely get nothing. And that's better than a guaranteed loss of $50. On the other hand, think about how things will seem to you if you're very confident that you're not going to buy the bet. Well, if you're very confident that you're not going to buy the bet, then you're very confident you're going to have $0. But if you were to buy the bet, given this imaging function, if you were to buy the bet, well, then there's a 50% chance that you would get 100 and a 50% chance that you would lose 50. And those are good odds. So if you're very confident that you're not going to buy the bet, then causal decision theory would say you should buy it. And I think that just still seems like bad advice to me. It still seems to me like, look, you know from the oracle's testimony, from the oracle's prophecy, that coin is going to land tails. Whether you buy the bet or not doesn't make any difference to whether the coin land tails. So it seems to me like you shouldn't buy the bet in this case. I think what's going on here is actually a kind of well-known and well-understood problem with theories of subjunctive supposition. And to introduce that problem sort of, think about the following setup. It's almost exactly the same setup that I had in the case of inadmissible foreknowledge. So suppose that I'm going to flip a coin and I offer you a bet on whether the coin lands heads. You refuse the bet, we go on, we flip the coin, and then the coin lands heads. So Sidney Morgenbesser observed back in the 70s that in that context, it sounds totally fine to say, hey, if you'd taken the bet, you would have won. And that's so, even though at the time when you made up your mind about whether to take the bet, it was a matter of chance whether the coin was going to land heads or tails. So, if you had this view about counterfactual supposition or subjunctive supposition, where the way to think about conditionals like MC is you go back to the time when you were making up your mind about whether or not to take the bet, sort of change the world minimally so as to have you take the bet, and then time evolve forward according to the laws of nature and see whether or not the consequence is true. If that was the way you were thinking about counterfactual supposition, well, then you would go back to the time when you were deciding whether or not to take the bet, you would have you take the bet and then time evolve forward, and you would get some possibilities where the coin lands heads and some possibilities where the coin lands tails. And so in the heads possibilities, you win, but in the tails possibilities, you lose. So it wouldn't be true to say that if you'd taken the bet, you would have won. So I think what the Morgenbesser conditional shows us is that when you're making counterfactual suppositions or subjunctive suppositions in this way, you don't always evaluate them by that procedure. You don't always evaluate them by making a minimal change to the world and time evolving forward according to the laws of nature. In particular, I think what it teaches us is that when you're making a subjunctive supposition, you hold fixed things which are causally independent of the thing that you're making the supposition about. Even if those things are a matter of chance at the time that you're making the supposition about, you hold them fixed if they're causally independent. And sort of importing that lesson from the semantics of counterfactuals into our decision theory, I think that we should say that the imaging function should satisfy this principle here that I'm going to call causal independence. And causal independence says if whether some proposition is true is causally independent of how you choose, then that proposition isn't going to change its truth value were you to choose any of the alternatives. Or more generally, for any proposition phi that's causally independent of whether you choose A, if you were to choose A at W, well, the probability that phi would be true is 1 if phi is actually true and 0 if phi is not actually true. Sorry, let me not use the word actually. It's 1 if phi is true at W and 0 if phi is false at W. So if we go back to the imaging function and we impose causal independence, then it's going to tell us that at the possibility where you don't take the bet and the coin lands heads, if you were to take the bet, the coin would still land heads. It's causally independent of whether you take the bet, whether the coin lands heads. So whether you take the bet doesn't make a difference. And similarly, at the possibility where you don't take the bet and the coin lands tails, if you were to take the bet, the coin would still land tails. Then, if we calculate utility using this imaging function, it'll turn out that taking the bet will have a negative utility and not taking the bet will have a utility of 0. So causal decision theory will say you shouldn't take the bet. In other words, once we've imposed this constraint, causal independence, which I think is sort of well motivated from other considerations in the theory of subjunctive supposition, causal decision theory is going to reason about this case, sorry, it's going to reason about this case in the following very intuitive and natural way. It's going to say, look, if you were to buy the bet, that wouldn't make any difference with respect to how the coin lands. And you know that the coin lands tails, so you shouldn't take the bet. In general, I think we should look at these kinds of cases, and we shouldn't draw the lesson that Spencer wants to draw, which is that it's impossible to get certain kinds of inadmissible foreknowledge. Instead, I think we should draw this lesson. The lesson is that the probability that some proposition would be true were you to choose A isn't always just the chance that that proposition has conditional on your choosing A. More particularly, If you choose A and that proposition's true, then the proposition would be true were you to choose A. And if the proposition's causally independent of how you choose, then it wouldn't change its truth value were you to choose A. Okay, so that's everything. Let me just summarize everything that I just said. I think that these decisions involving foreknowledge don't pose any new problems for causal decision theory. In decisions like Sticker, what causal decision theory says might seem counterintuitive, but no more counterintuitive than what causal decision theory says about cases like no difference. And the error theory that causal decision theory gives of our intuitions in cases like no difference carries over and applies straightforwardly to decisions like Sticker. In both cases, we should say, these are decisions where you have control over your rational credence that the world is a certain way without having control over whether the world is that way. And in precisely those kinds of cases, we shouldn't trust our intuitions about the instrumental value of our choices. Secondly, in decisions like inadmissible foreknowledge, we do have a problem, but it's not a problem for causal decision theory as such. Instead, it's actually a pretty well-known and well-understood problem for our theories of subjunctive suppositions. And the solution that we use for the semantics of counterfactuals applies straightforwardly in the context of decision theory. And causal decision theory says the right thing in those cases. Nonetheless, I think that these kinds of decisions involving foreknowledge can teach us or vividly illustrate for us two important lessons about instrumental value. And the first is when you have when you have control over what you should believe about whether some proposition is true, but you don't have any control over whether that proposition is true, your intuitions about instrumental value can be distorted by an agential illusion of control, which conflates control over what you should believe with control over what is actually the case. And the second lesson is that we should be careful to distinguish the probability that an outcome would result were you to choose A with the chance that that outcome has conditional on your choosing A. And that's everything that I have to say for myself. So thanks for listening.